Chapter 2 The People of the Snake. Halima and Nima, perched on the city wall, peered down as the caravan containing the wedding gifts from King Aligbadi appeared at the city gates. They were not the only rapt spectators. The streets below were packed with women carrying baskets on their heads, filled with shark meat, cassava melons, and other wares they had brought to market. Along with hordes of barefoot children, they stopped and lined the street to watch the spectacle, hands at their fat hips. A gaily dressed band of musicians led the procession. Their wrists and ankles were covered with a shower of grass and jangling bells. Marching to the beat of drums, they filled the air with intermingling sounds. High-pitched whistles and sweetly singing flutes and oboes and harps, the crystalline ring of the xylophone, ivory trumpets carved with charging elephants shouted out triumph and joy. Yet beneath the clamor there was another sound, nearly drowned out, yet always vaguely present. Halima could not see what instrument produced it, but it was a low hiss, like steam rising up from between rocks, or a snake slithering over dry grass. "Look!" Nima cooed. Halima leaned forward. 10 elephants, each as white as the shell of an ostrich, their faces costumed in bronze masks, lumbered through the city gates, each holding the tail of the one before it. The 2 girls leaned so far over the wall they nearly toppled over. It was impossible for Halima to suppress childish wonder at the scene. Next came 100 prize bulls, whipped along by young boys in kidskin, along with rams and oxen for the slaughter. 50 sleek black stallions, nostrils flaring proudly, trotted behind. Following the animals, bearers marched, toting barrels of honey wine, chest after chest of ivory and jade, crates of silver and velvet. The crowd roared in approval at each new arrival. Well, thought Halima, at least he isn't cheap. She leaned her chin on her fist as more gifts arrived. Then strode row after row of warriors, long and lean young jaguars. Each shook his spear above his head as they marched and sang, their boisterous chant mixing with the triumphant voice of the trumpet. "We are the people of the snake. We always conquer. When we march, the earth trembles." The girls leaned forward in unison at the sight of the young men. Each warrior carried a large oval shield of buffalo hide, adorned with 2 intertwined serpents, one red and the other black. The young men's hair was long and braided, decorated with ostrich feathers. Chins jutted proudly, and thick, strong arms strained against bracelets of buffalo horn and wood. Upon closer inspection, Halima could see a line of tattooed scars dotted their broad shoulders like buttons. How brave they must be to endure those scars, Halima thought in awe. Nima wrinkled her nose in disgust at the sight of the scars, and then craned, squinting for a better look at the foreign warriors. After a moment she glanced at Halima, who watched the arriving spectacle without comment. "So, your gloriousness, I suppose you see this kind of thing every day." "It's quite a show," Halima admitted, noncommittally. "Well," Nima sniffed, "no one will ever make a fuss like this over my wedding." Halima pinched Nima's chubby arm. "And why should they, you good-for-nothing child of a fisherman?" she laughed. Nima shuffled a few steps away, rubbing the sore spot. Halima put an arm around her shoulders and drew her back toward her. "I don't know why I tolerate your insolent tongue," the princess scolded affectionately. 6 drummers, marching abreast, announced the arrival at the gate of an important person. A ram's horn blared, and Halima held her breath, waiting for her husband to beat to make his appearance. To her embarrassment, she found her knees knocking rapidly together as if she had to urinate. "Come, show yourself now," she thought impatiently. "Show yourself, damn you, and enough fanfare." At last, borne by 6 burly men, came an elegant carriage, draped in black cloths hiding the person inside. No princely banner rose above the carriage. Nima exploded with disappointment. "It's not their king, some musty old dignitary." Halima sighed, oddly relieved, and pulled her handmaiden from the wall. "Come, we must prepare to meet him." They raced down the stone staircase to Halima's chamber. Neema bathed her in hot ass's milk, and then drenched her flesh with coconut oil. Sweet-smelling leaves were pressed under her arms for perfume. She was clothed in a silk robe trimmed with brightly colored beads and bedecked with a slew of bracelets of gold and copper, long looping earrings, and other jewelry. Of all this finery, only one piece had any value to Halima, a turtle-shell necklace on which there hung a royal pendant bearing the likeness of a sea turtle, the symbol of her clan. When she was finally ready, they entered the king's hall, an enormous chamber strewn with silken carpets and full of sturdy ebony furniture. Wendepali, the king's griot, was committing to memory a full record of the gifts they received. An army of scribes also knelt beside crates of ivory and jade, making an exact count of the contents. But his oral account of this day would be the sacred record. Wendepali was a rabbity, white-haired old man, meek but good-hearted. Halima had always felt a great deal of affection for him. He scurried over to meet the princess. "My dear child, you must meet the emissary from King Aligbadi, his chief counselor and slave general, Master Makalai." A chill rushed over Halima at the name. Out of the shadows emerged a tall, gaunt man, dressed in a turban and the flowing white robe of an elder. One arm trailed off to a deformed, three-fingered hand, Halima observed. But that gripped her attention far less than his eyes, the yellow, saurian eyes of a crocodile. As he slowly bowed and then raised his head, he never once took those eyes from hers. When he smiled, Halima could see that his teeth had been filed down to sharp points, and when he spoke, his voice was a soft, sibilant hiss. "Illustrious princess, I greet you and pass on to you the love of my master, the noble King Aligbadi." "I welcome you to the country of my father, wise Master Makalai," she replied, bowing in return. The emissary continued, "We regret that our Mfura, the noble King Aligbadi the Trustworthy, could not greet you in person. Regrettably, the king is attending to affairs of state. He has sent me in his place to prostrate myself before your father and plead for your hand in marriage on his behalf. King Aligbadi will meet us at the winding river that flows from the Silver Mountain. From there, we will travel on to your new kingdom." Halima frowned and turned to Wendepali. "I thought my wedding was to take place here." The griot explained, "It's the tradition among the people of the Snake that all their weddings take place at a holy lake in their land." Halima was unable to disguise her unhappiness. To travel such a great distance in the company of strangers. Master Makalai smiled at her, his yellow eyes unblinking. Halima considered him, and then announced firmly, "I wish my own guard to accompany me to your country." She imagined she saw a look of dismay flash across the face of the emissary with the speed of a lizard darting across the grass. Master Makalai turned to Wendepali. "Does your king think we are unable to protect his daughter?" he inquired in his odd, disconcerting hiss. The little man seemed flustered for a moment, then recovered and replied, "The prowess of your warriors is legendary, wise Master Makalai. The child speaks only of an honor guard to carry the praises of our king to noble King Aligbadi." The emissary nodded, and the tension that momentarily filled the room now eased. Finally he blinked, and Halima found herself able to breathe again for the first time since the conversation began. That night, the emissary Master Makalai was treated to an evening of feasting and entertainment, including jugglers, dancers, magicians, and storytellers, Wendepali among them. Halima watched him closely and noticed that while the visitor politely applauded each act, he seemed to take no real joy in any of it, sitting rock-still as a toad. She wondered what would give this strange man joy. Chosen to lead the dozen-man honor guard was King Babatunde's sword-bearer, Badongo, whose forefathers had served Halima's family for 12 generations. He was a broad-shouldered man of bronze, stout as a baobab tree. His clean-shaven head glistened, the style of the fishing people of the southern coast. Badongo was a cousin of her handmaiden Nima through their great-grandfather. Although they were related, a marriage between them was possible, and even prized among their people. For a man to marry a woman related to him through his paternal grandfather was spoken of with pride as waking the hut of the father. The union was unlikely, though. Nima had always looked down her nose at the burly servant. When he visited Halima in the palace garden, he was bare-chested and wore a short sword in a leather sheath, strapped to a rawhide belt. Her tittering handmaidens ran and hid themselves. It was rare that a man came here. Badongo dropped to his knees before Halima. "Gentle princess, I have been ordered by your father, the king Babatunde the Good, to accompany you to your new home, and on this journey to protect your life with my own. I have made this solemn oath at the shrine of my grandfather." Halima looked down at the kneeling warrior. She knew him well from childhood. He was like a tree that could not be uprooted by the most powerful storm. She smiled at the sword-bearer. "Faithful Badongo, I do believe that while you live, no harm shall come to me." The warrior bowed shyly. Her handmaidens came out of hiding as Badongo strode off. "They are always giggling," Halima thought, slightly annoyed, "about things I do not understand." 3 days later, a great caravan left the city of Kali. As well as the dozen-man honor guard sent by Babatunde, the grand party included the warriors of King Aligbadi, 50 horsemen, 100 spearmen, and 20 bowmen. It was well that their force was strong, because their journey would take them across the plain through the country of their enemy, the Zimbai. Even more warriors would have escorted the travelers had reports not indicated that the Zimbai were engaged in a fierce battle with another tribe 50 miles away. The bearers returned with many gifts for Aligbadi, jars of honey, banana wine, and millet beer, and finally wrought ceremonial axes and spears. Halima and her 7 handmaidens rode in 2 golden tipoyes, or carriages borne by men on foot. In one, she and Nima rode stretched out comfortably on velvet cushions, playing ore, the game of pebbles. In the other, the remainder of her servants played with their pet monkeys and cats. As the caravan marched away from the tall spires of Kali, Halima gazed back mournfully. If only she could stay another day, another hour, perhaps she could stand to leave. She saw a figure waving to her from atop the city wall, a silhouette against the bright morning sun. She knew it was her father. "He looks like a ghost already," she thought with a shiver. Halima looked back toward the sea. She had said prayers and left libations at the tomb of her mother and forebears, making peace with them. But still, it was said that misfortune awaits those who travel too far from the land where their ancestors are buried. "We will never hear the sounds of the ocean again, gentle Nima," she remarked wistfully. Her handmaiden gave a mischievous grin and pulled out from her calabash bag a simple necklace made of copper wire run through a single large spiked seashell. It was far less fancy than the servant girl's usual fare. Nima told her, "My mother gave me this present. Here, hold it to your ear." Halima did so, and could hear the comforting, familiar roar of waves rushing to the shore. She smiled and returned it to her servant. "You see," Nima said, proudly holding up the charm, "as long as we have this, we will always be able to hear the ocean." The caravan passed through towns built of stone and others built of mud, past neatly laid out villages of round houses and fields crowded with banana trees. Spare, wiry men, thin from digging walls or crouching over potter's wheels, stood up as they passed. Women stopped their weaving and waved with infants in their arms. Young boys, loincloths flapping in the wind, ran out and followed the caravan for miles, beating their own small drums and marching alongside the warriors. The caravan climbed the steep hill country, where broad-backed smiths, her father's kin, forged iron, mumbling strange incantations and mixing their blood into bubbling vats of molten ore. They rode through valleys where proud herdsmen drove their cattle. They traveled past fields of giant stone heads, strong, helmeted faces shattered half to dust, decaying monuments to some ancient conquerors long forgotten. In a few days they reached the great savanna, a flat, endless vista of pale yellow grass. Peeking out from between the silk curtains of the carriage, Halima gazed out over the landscape. In its own way, she had to confess, it was as magnificent as the ocean with its own limitless horizon. It is as if it were indeed a sea, she thought. Steady easterly winds set a rippling wave across the grass. The veldt was crowded with wildlife. As they rode along, she and Nima competed to be the first to spy each breed of animal. Halima first saw a herd of ostriches rushing across the plain, leaving a blizzard of feathers in their wake. Nima pointed out the tall giraffes galloping alongside the caravan, strangely graceful despite their long and bony legs. But it was Halima who spotted the lonely elephant, digging sullenly for water with its tusks. In the distance, Halima could see the Silver Mountain, rising up from the veldt like a tall green fortress. A perfect pyramid, its peak sparkled as if crowned by colossal diamonds. Dark, stormy clouds nestled it like circling vultures. Nima nudged her and pointed. "They say giants live atop that mountain," she whispered confidentially. "They carry off young maidens and cook them." Halima smirked at her fanciful servant. She called out to Madango, who was riding nearby. He trotted over. "Faithful Madango, is it true that giants live in that mountain?" Halima asked with some embarrassment. She did not want him to think she was a foolish child. The warrior considered her soberly, as if he did not consider the question in any way comical, and then looked off at the mist-enshrouded mountain. "People say there is a strange race of tall warriors who live there among the spirits of the mountain. There are forests where men live who are no taller than children. In caves in the north, there live men whose skins are white. Who can declare there is no race of giants?" Halima stared at the far-off peak. She thought she would never again see anything in nature so awe-inspiring as the great ocean. But there was an unearthly beauty to that distant mountain, vaulting so proudly into the heavens, that held her and seemed to beckon. Halima awoke, startled to find Nima shaking her as if the carriage were on fire. She'd been dreaming about her mother, she realized, but the essence of the dream quickly fled like water draining from a sieve. "Look outside!" Nima cried in excitement. "Little fool, I told you not to wake me every time you see a filthy vulture," Halima growled sleepily. They'd been traveling a week now, and her handmaidens still found it necessary to point out every animal they passed. "Don't be so grumpy," Nima said, continuing to stir her. Her handmaiden pulled the curtain aside and pointed out to the veldt. A lion, its muscles rippling, bounded after a young deer. Halima felt her heart leap in instant sympathy for the fleeing, doomed animal. The girls watched in fascination as the antelope turned and twisted, trying desperately to evade capture. "Run! Run!" the girls cried out. They could hear the men of the caravan crying out as well, rooting for the lion. Finally, the big cat lunged at the antelope and brought the braying animal down. Nima screeched and looked away. Halima forced herself to look on as the lion tore and rended its prey, pulling off chunks of flesh and sinew until all the fur of its face was smeared red with blood. "Awful beast," Nima wept. Halima put her arm around her friend. "That is nature's way, Nima," Halima told her sternly. Then she shut her own eyes, trying to dispel the picture of the brutal slaughter. That afternoon they reached the winding river, which flowed from the great Silver Mountain. It ran quickly and was clear as crystal. On the bottom they could see the bones of animals as well as a few human skulls made smooth by the running water. A few broken shields and spears rested there silently, half buried in the mud. In the distance the falls rumbled, sounding like boulders crashing down. Halima sighed at the sight of the river. Here at last they were. Now she would finally meet her husband-to-be, the celebrated King Ali-Badi. Across the river, a party of about 50 warriors stood waiting. Halima craned for a glimpse of her betrothed. Squinting through her curtains, she could make out a figure on horseback, wearing a high, feathered headdress. That must be King Ali-Badi, she thought. The horns of the caravan blared, announcing their arrival. Almost immediately, a drum signal returned, welcoming them and inviting them to ford the river. Madango rode back to Halima's carriage. His brow was knitted like the face of a worried parent. "Princess, it would be safer for you to cross the river on horseback," he informed her. Halima assented, and she and her handmaidens crawled out of their carriages. With some diffidence, Madango put his broad hands around Halima's waist. She felt a rush of blood to her cheeks. No man had ever held her before. With seemingly no effort at all, the warrior hoisted her into the saddle. He took her delicate fingers in his broad hands and planted them on the horse's mane. "Just hold on, Princess," he said. Halima watched as the warrior pulled off his robes, stripping down to a slender loincloth. She noticed his broad and powerful back, like a rhino's, she thought. Taking the reins, he gingerly led the horse into the chilly waters of the winding river. Halima looked down at the churning waters. The base of the river seemed dizzyingly far away. She was a strong swimmer, but there was something about this uncontrolled rush of water that completely unnerved her. With crystal clarity, she could picture herself being swept downriver. She clenched the horse's mane in her fist and focused on Madango's thick neck, trying to ignore the current. Several times she was sure the powerful current would uproot the warrior. But straining against the river, he stayed upright and continued to tug the horse's rein. Sometimes the horse pulled away, fearful of falling, but finally it found its faith in Madango, allowing him to guide it across the river. At last the horse, hooves slipping and sliding on the silk-smooth mud, clambered out of the water and onto the river bank. Exhausted from his effort, Madango bent, hands gripping his knees, panting. Halima leaned down from the saddle and gently touched his broad, sweaty shoulder. "Thank you, faithful Madango. Thank you for making me feel safe." The warrior turned and looked up at her, as if her words were a blessing from a priestess. Masamakali had already made the crossing, and he stood by the horse of King Ali-Badi, a milk-white mare. King Ali-Badi grinned broadly. He was a young man of no more than 20 years, with a round face, a plump, soft belly, and bird-like arms, slender as a girl's. His headdress was festooned with hundreds of brightly colored feathers, and yards of bright gold chains hung around his neck. The instant Halima saw him, her heart sank. This was not the lion her seer had described. Then she scolded herself immediately. How unfair to judge a man by his appearance. The king saluted her. "Most illustrious, most kind, gentle, most beautiful, most radiant Princess Halima, I, King Ali-Badi, who is unworthy even to wash the dust from your feet, salute you. I throw myself before you as your humble servant." Halima covered her mouth. She almost giggled at the pompous greeting, but biting her lower lip, she resisted. She replied, "The honor is mine, noble King Ali-Badi. My father Babatunde sends his greetings." The young ruler spurred his mare forward. He trotted slowly around Halima, and she could sense his gaze passing across her long neck, full lips, and gentle curves, burning her like the noon sun. He faced her, eyes aglow, and murmured, "If you are as sweet to taste as to look upon, I will have found a worthy wife." Halima whispered back, "If your courage matches the glitter of your gold, I will have found a worthy husband." The king chuckled, then spoke loudly so that all could hear. "I know you have traveled far. Let us rest a while here and learn about each other. But his slave General Masamacali counseled the king. This is not a good place to tarry, lord. This crossing is a favorite place of ambush for the Zimbai. Very well, the king responded. We will move on then. He took Halima's hand and kissed it. Tonight we will camp, and you and I will get to know each other better. Halima bowed. The bearers had struggled across the river with their carriage. Halima returned to it and found her handmaiden Nima waiting impatiently. He's too fat, Nima submitted immediately. Halima, who was in no mood now for impudence, replied, Of course, you're too childish to know the true measure of a man. Nima snorted. I can measure his belly from here. To me, it looks just like a pregnant woman. Halima slapped her face. Your foolish mouth will be the end of you, she shot back. Tears began to stream from Nima's eyes. Immediately, Halima regretted the blow. She reached for the other girl, but Nima pulled away, folding her arms across her big bosom and throwing back her head proudly. Halima sighed. She was furious, but not sure yet with whom. The caravan, now reinforced by the warriors of Alagbadi, continued across the plain. Halima and Nima slept in their tipoye, heads bobbing together. The heat poured through the silk coverings of the carriage, making them both sweat as if in a fever. Halima drifted back and forth between the world of dreams to reality. In her uneasy dreams, a snake, as big as a man, slithered around in the carriage with them, winding itself around and around her. Try as she might to slip away, the snake pursued her, sliding through her legs and thighs, intertwining with her, until she could not tell where the snake ended and she began. I'm hungry, Nima announced loudly. Halima opened her eyes. She shuddered, still feeling the slimy beast coiling around her. Nima fished in a jar for some millet cakes her mother had stored for her. She passed one to Halima and took two for herself. I hope we'll be stopping soon. Bumping and swaying is making me seasick. She flicked a beetle off the cake and chowed down greedily. Halima nodded. Think about the poor fellows who have to carry the thing. I think one of them likes me, Nima said casually. The short one. Halima took a bite from her cake. What did he tell you? He didn't say anything. He winked at me. Twice. Halima laughed. Then, from outside the carriage, they heard a deep bellow of warning. A chorus of cries went up. The warriors of King Alagbadi roared in their language, and there was a sudden commotion outside. The carriage stopped with a jerk, throwing the two girls forward. It crashed to the ground like a bird with its wings clipped off in midair, spilling the two girls on top of each other. What is the matter with those fools? Nima yelped. Outside, screaming horses reared, and frantic, high-pitched voices barked and jabbered conflicting orders. Halima threw back the curtain. From out of the tall grass, 1,000 painted warriors rose, spears in hand. Their faces were dotted with the markings of the Zimbai. Halima shut the curtain. Nima struggled to get by. What's going on? Let me see, she demanded. Sit still, ordered Halima. An arrow ripped through the roof of the tipoye and flew into the pillow with a thunk, right between Nima's plump thighs. Nima squealed in terror, and then began to shriek again and again as if the arrow were an asp about to strike. Halima caught her and wrapped her arms around the hysterical girl. The warriors will protect us. Don't be afraid. Everything will be all right. She cracked the curtains half an inch and stared out. A shower of arrows rained down on the defenders of the caravan. The Zimbai charged, yodeling out their war cry and bounding forward with long, powerful strides. The warriors of King Alagbadi took up defensive positions around the caravan, bracing themselves for the attack. Halima pulled the curtain shut. Nima began to weep, and Halima took her to her breast as if she were a small child. She clapped her hands over her handmaiden's ears and began to pray to her ancestors for their intervention. Outside, she heard the screams of the dying and the ring of metal slapping metal as shields collided. Through the curtains, she could see the shadows of warriors doing battle as spears thrust and men fell. To her alarm, she realized the din of battle was growing louder and closer. As if tossed from a bucket, blood splashed across the silk curtains of the carriage. Halima heard the shrieks of young girls. She opened the curtains and saw that the tepoye behind them was on fire and surrounded by Zimbai warriors. One by one, the girls were plucked from the burning caravan like chunks of food carried off by black ants. Each was flung over the broad shoulder of one of the Zimbai and carried off. Halima watched in horror as each of her handmaidens vanished, even little Aisha, pounding the chest of her captor and lashing at him with her tiny feet. Where was her proud husband-to-be, King Ali-Badi? Up on a hill, Halima could see him running from the battle, his short, stumpy legs pumping fiercely. 4 of his warriors followed behind, each few steps turning to fire off a volley of arrows. The 12 warriors of King Babatunde clung close to the carriage, rearing up on their horses. The Zimbai used ropes and spears to drag down the warriors, and each in turn was quickly butchered. Behind her, Halima heard the sound of ripping cloth. Nima shrieked and grabbed hold of her arm, sinking her fingernails into her flesh. A short sword rent the curtains in the rear of the carriage and sliced a long, narrow slit. Halima slid back on her rump and scrambled for a spoon or knife to use as a weapon. Before her trembling hands found anything, a bald black head, covered with blood, rammed its way through the ripped curtain like a child's head emerging from the womb. Halima's heart leapt as she recognized Madango. His broad chest heaved and he panted mightily. "The caravan is lost," he cried. He ripped the curtain away and pointed to the tall grass 100 yards off. "We must reach the high grass." Between the carriage and the grass, warriors of the 2 sides crashed into each other, shield against shield, like rams locking horns. Wounded men, filled with arrows like pincushions, staggered by bleeding. "Hurry!" Madango cried. Halima scrambled forward. "Come!" she called to Nima. The servant girl sat paralyzed, clutching her cushion. Halima yanked her by the arm, but Nima moaned and shook her head violently from side to side, refusing to move. "Leave her, princess," Madango shouted. "No!" Halima cried. "Put her on your back." The warrior groaned. He grabbed Nima and threw her over his shoulder. With his free hand, he helped Halima down from the carriage. He planted her hand on his belt. "Follow me. Don't let go no matter what happens." Madango charged forward like a rampaging bull into the thick of battle. She darted along behind him, barely able to keep up as he twisted left and right to avoid the gauntlet of spears, occasionally bashing broad shoulders with the combatants. They hopped over bloody carcasses, which lay broken, strewn about the clearing. The tall grass, which had seemed so close, appeared to hang in the distance like a shimmering mirage. Halima clenched Madango's belt and clung close to him. She screamed as a hand reached greedily for her. Madango swung back and lopped it off with his sword. Halima shut her eyes and kept running. At last she felt the comforting tickle of grass against her legs. They reached the tall grass and fell face forward into it. Nima slid off Madango's shoulders and fell down on all 4s. Again paralysis set in, and she knelt, eyes clenched closed. She clasped her hands and began to babble a babyish prayer to the Great One in the sky. Halima looked back over her shoulder for pursuers. The soldiers of Ali-Badi had been put to rout, fleeing in all directions. The Zimbai, who did not believe in needless slaughter, did not pursue them. Instead, they plundered the caravan, picking it clean like vultures stripping a corpse. They passed the stores of gold and silver hand to hand, as if they were members of a fire brigade handing along jugs of water. Others were dancing around the caravan, chanting triumphantly and thrusting their spears into the sky. They crowed, "We are the people of the plain. No one passes without paying tribute." It seemed to Halima that she and her companions had escaped unseen. Then a Zimbai warrior dropped his load of spoils and pointed in their direction. He let out a holler, and he and several others came running straight at them.